On the edge of a cliff, where the mist from the ocean forever shrouds the land in a veil of dampness, stood a palace made of black stone that seemed to absorb the sunlight. On the day of its opening, which took place on the 12th of May, 1920, the lead architect was found dead in the central hall, even though all the doors were locked from the inside and the keys rested in the pocket of the owner, who was thousands of miles away. The walls of the building, which possessed the strange property of vibrating in unison with the heartbeat of anyone who crossed the threshold, exuded a chill that could not be explained by the laws of physics. The Rockefellers, who had planned to make this place their summer residence, refused the purchase 48 hours after their first visit, citing an overwhelming desire to immediately destroy the blueprints and forget the very existence of the foundation itself. The architecture of the structure violated all conceivable canons of geometry. The corners of the rooms never met at a right angle, creating an illusion of an infinitely expanding space where the observer's eye lost its footing. During the rare hours when the sun broke through the dense veil of sea vapors, the shadows inside the rooms lengthened and took on strange, almost anthropomorphic shapes. Every column was covered with fine cracks that, if examined closely, formed patterns resembling the structure of the human nervous system. The air here always remained motionless, like frozen resin, and held within it echoes of sounds that should not have existed in nature. The arriving delegation, representing the interests of the influential family, encountered anomalies within the first minutes of their stay. The palace seemed to resist the presence of the strangers, forcing them to experience bouts of irrational horror, followed by instantaneous apathy. One of the trusted associates accompanying the delegation later swore that he saw the doorways change their location the moment he turned his gaze away for a fraction of a second. The silence reigning in the corridors was not an absence of sound but appeared to be a dense, crushing matter capable of absorbing any attempts at communication. People felt as though their own thoughts were turning into something alien, losing their connection to their will. Inside the building, time flowed differently. The mechanical watches brought by the assistants stopped 20 minutes after crossing the threshold, their hands began to spin madly in reverse before freezing forever. The feeling of being constantly watched pursued every guest, even though the halls remained empty. At one point, a representative of the family accidentally touched a wall in the library and felt the black stone's pulsation synchronize with his own pulse for a second, causing him to faint and experience visions he was afraid to speak of even under oath. By the end of the first day, it became obvious that the palace demanded sacrifices, not limiting itself to the mere physical presence of people. Vague stains began to appear on the walls, suspiciously resembling human handprints, and with every passing minute, their number grew. An inexplicable fear gripped everyone present when, in one of the galleries, they discovered oil paintings depicting themselves in a state of advanced old age, even though there had been no paintings in the house until that moment. The realization that the building was capable of seeing the future and distorting it forced the delegation to quickly leave the estate. The decision to completely decline the purchase was made instantly and without discussion. No one wanted to return to these halls, which felt like a living, hostile organism that fed on the fears and hopes of its visitors. The transaction documents were burned in a hotel fireplace, and the blueprints sent by the architect were consigned to the flames along with personal belongings that might carry even the slightest trace of their stay in the cursed place. In the history of the family, this episode remained hidden under a seal of absolute secrecy, and the palace itself plunged into sleep for decades, waiting for someone foolish enough to open its heavy, ironclad doors once more. The empty halls of the palace lived a life of their own, invisible to the eye. The air in the corridors, which stretched for hundreds of paces, was saturated with the smell of ozone and old iron. Huge mirrors installed in every room did not reflect reality accurately. People passing by noticed that their doubles in the glass moved with a fraction of a second delay, and sometimes refused to follow the original entirely. At midnight, a grinding noise would drift from the basement, resembling the sound of giant gears turning in a mechanism crafted from flesh and metal. A local legend claimed that the palace was not built for people, but as a giant trap for creatures dwelling in the space between seconds. As dusk fell, the internal space of the house would begin to breathe, contracting and expanding in a rhythm inaccessible to human hearing. The walls became covered with a thin network of frost, which upon closer inspection proved to be not frozen moisture, but a collection of microscopic crystalline structures capable of recording images of the past. The shadows cast by the furniture began to move on their own, outpacing the movement of the moonlight. In these empty halls, the echo of footsteps did not fade but, on the contrary, transformed into an indistinct whisper, calling lost souls to remain within these walls forever. The mirror surfaces represented the greatest danger for anyone who dared to linger here longer than intended. The reflections, once merely pale copies, gradually gained a will of their own and sought to switch places with real people. Casual visitors glancing into these glasses noticed their doubles beginning to smile when they themselves felt only fear, or reaching hands out from the depths of the amalgam, trying to grasp at the escaping reality. In those mirrors, time was stretched into an endless loop, forcing anyone who looked into them to see their own demise in thousands of different variations. The basements, hidden behind heavy oak doors each equipped with 12 locks, remained the abode of the very pulse of darkness. The hum emanating from the depths of the foundation seeped into the bones, causing numbness and a strange sense of déjà vu that would haunt a person for many years to come. It was said that deep underground, at a depth of 50 meters, rested a certain device consisting of hundreds of thousands of bronze parts that continued to operate without any external energy. It was this mechanism that was responsible for the distortions in space and time, turning the palace into a predatory structure that consumed the very essence of those who attempted to unravel its mystery. At night, lights remained on throughout the estate, even though the electrical circuits had been disconnected 40 years ago. A faint, phosphorescent glow emanated directly from the stone, bathing the halls in a deathly pale light. During these hours, the palace transformed into a likeness of a living, breathing creature whose capillary corridors pumped thick, dark energy collected from those who had been reckless enough to find themselves here. The air became so heavy that breathing was difficult, and every movement required immense effort, as if gravity within these rooms had increased tenfold. The secret of the palace was tightly bound to the very structure of reality that it sought to subordinate to its will. For decades, the palace remained a silent witness to how the world outside changed, all while remaining trapped in its own temporal cage. Local residents tried to bypass this place by a mile, feeling on a subconscious level that the very existence of the Black Castle was a threat to the established order of things. No one dared to approach it, understanding that inside, among the endless mirrors and the eternal hum of gears, time had finally stopped for everyone who had even once crossed the threshold of this cursed place. 3 decades later, a daring antique collector bought the estate, hoping to turn it into a private museum. He brought with him a staff of assistants who were supposed to catalog every detail of the interior, starting from the ground floor and ending at the attic. The work progressed painfully slowly, as any iron tools would inexplicably crumble into dust upon contact with the masonry. Every night someone from the crew would go missing, and in the morning, new bas-reliefs would be discovered on the walls, depicting the faces of the vanished, frozen in expressions of silent screams. The collector, locking himself in his study, began keeping a diary where, day after day, he recorded how his own body was gradually becoming transparent. The atmosphere inside the estate began to dictate its own cruel rules from the very first days. The assistants, accustomed to strict order and discipline, faced the impossibility of completing basic tasks. Whenever one of them raised a hammer or a crowbar toward a wall, the metal would instantly oxidize, turning into gray, lifeless rubble. Area measurements constantly fluctuated, and corridors that seemed short in the morning would turn into winding labyrinths by evening, leading to completely different parts of the house. The feeling of disorientation became a constant companion for everyone who dared to linger in the halls after sunset. The first disappearance occurred 9 days after the work began. A young archivist simply stepped into the next room for some blueprints and never returned. No one heard a sound of a struggle or a cry for help, only a barely perceptible hum, reminiscent of the building itself sighing. The next morning, the collector, while making his rounds, discovered a new bas-relief in the corner of the library that captured the missing employee's facial features with striking accuracy. The image was executed with such detail that it seemed as if the man were entombed in the stone alive. This discovery plunged the remaining workers into a state of paralysis bordering on madness. The collector, obsessed with his idea of creating a museum, refused to acknowledge the obvious danger. He linked the events to a phenomenon of ancient magic or forgotten technologies, believing that each new face on the wall was simply a way for the house to preserve the history of its inhabitants. He began spending his nights in complete solitude, studying the diaries of previous owners that had miraculously survived in hidden niches. With every page written by the hand of a man who lived there in 1920, the collector understood that his time was inexorably slipping away along with the very flesh of his body. His hands were the first to begin succumbing to the strange transformation. At first, his fingers took on a frightening pallor, and then mechanisms that had no relation to human anatomy began to show through his skin. In his diary, he recorded these changes in dry, almost scientific language, realizing that he was becoming part of the museum's collection. He stopped coming out to his remaining assistants, fearing that the sight of his translucent body would be the final argument for their immediate flight from the cursed mansion. By the end of the second month, only 7 people remained in the staff of assistants. They began to suspect that their employer was hiding something monstrous and resolved to attempt to storm his study. However, upon reaching the doors, they discovered that the study had turned into part of the architectural decor, and the passage to it simply ceased to exist. The wall at that spot was already adorned with dozens of new bas-reliefs, among which were the faces of those who had disappeared in the last few weeks. The palace continued its harvest, gradually consuming everyone who attempted to impose their own rules and order upon it, turning living people into eternal witnesses of its dark history. The moment had arrived when the boundary between the master of the house and the walls themselves practically vanished. The collector ceased to consume food and water, feeding solely on the cold radiance emanating from the vaulted ceilings. He realized that the palace was not an architectural structure, but a complex organism requiring constant nourishment from human memories and life force. With every written page of the diary, events of the past that had occurred hundreds of years ago emerged on the corridor walls as clear, terrifying pictures. He understood why the richest family in the world had fled from here. The Rockefellers discovered that the palace did not simply absorb people, it rewrote the history of reality, erasing those who dared to study its secrets. Images that did not belong to his memory began to surface in the collector's mind. He saw the construction of this foundation in the year 1512, when workers sacrificed their shadows to lay the groundwork for the eternal existence of the palace. Every detail of the decor, every curve of the handrails was saturated with the suffering of those whose fates became woven into the stone. Now he himself was becoming part of this endless process, feeling how his own memories of his childhood home and his first love were being drawn from his brain like thin threads of a spiderweb, absorbing into the cold masonry. The palace actively used the accumulated material to create new illusions. Figures from the past began to materialize in the halls. Aristocrats in outfits from 300 years ago strolled silently along the galleries, oblivious to the presence of a living human. The collector watched them, understanding that these were mere echoes, puppets controlled by the will of the building itself. He tried to resist, clutching a pencil in his transparent fingers, but with every line dedicated to the history of this place, his personality inexorably melted away, being replaced by a sum of alien, monstrous experiences. It became clear that the Rockefellers were merely the first of those who recognized the danger. Around the year 1920, they approached the line beyond which lay the complete loss of humanity. They saw how the palace slowly redrew the map of the world, making it so that people who perished within its walls had never been born in reality. The disappearance of a person here was accompanied by the erasure of all traces of their existence, photographs, documents, mentions in books. This was not merely death, it was a complete annulment of the very fact of their existence in reality. Realizing this, the collector experienced a chilling horror, which, however, was not accompanied by the usual physical reactions. His body no longer possessed a heart capable of beating faster, nor lungs in need of oxygen. He became an observer in a trap that he himself had helped to activate. In the diary, which had long ceased to be paper and had begun to manifest directly on the surface of the floor, he wrote the final truth: the palace is a kind of predatory archive, storing stolen lives within itself to maintain its own functionality for thousands of years. His will still clung to the remnants of common sense, trying to find a way to break this cycle. He searched for a vulnerable point in the structure of the building, hoping that somewhere there existed a lever or a magical node capable of stopping the mechanism. However, every step through the corridors only brought him closer to the realization that he himself was this node. The palace had not simply used him, it had been waiting for his arrival for all these 30 years so that, with the help of the collector's knowledge, it could complete the construction of its main, final part, capable of extending its tentacles far beyond the cliff where it was once founded. On the last night, when the moon was hidden by clouds, the palace began to transform. The walls, previously motionless, rippled like the surface of a deep lake into which a heavy stone had been thrown. The collector, already nearly dissolved into the space, saw the very doubles whose movements had always lagged begin to emerge from the mirrors. They were perfectly symmetrical and featureless, representing a void cloaked in human form. All the accumulated experience, all the knowledge about the world gathered over long years, began to flow out of the consciousness of the last inhabitant into the foundation of the palace, which with every moment became more real and vivid, as if preparing for an emergence into the world of men. The transformation process was accompanied by a low-frequency hum, from which the building's foundation began to crumble, casting a myriad of sparks of cold light into the night air. The collector felt his consciousness tearing into thousands of fragments, each becoming a part of the palace's general matrix. He no longer felt pain or fear, only the cold, detached grandeur of realizing that he was the key to the great transition. Every thought that had ever occurred to him was turning into an architectural element, strengthening a structure prepared for an emergence into another reality. The faceless doubles filled the entire space of the halls, moving with frightening synchronicity. They made no sounds, but their presence weighed upon perception, creating a sense of thousands of voices merging into a single chorus. They slowly approached the center, where the collector's translucent body hovered in the air like the eye of a cyclone. It felt as though the palace was gathering all its victims, accumulated over 5 centuries, to use them as energy for its final lunge into the material world. At that moment, the boundaries of reality thinned to the limit. Through the walls, which now resembled a translucent membrane, visions of the outside world seeped through: sleeping cities, bustling ports, distant lights of a civilization that did not yet suspect the coming invasion. The palace craved this space. It sought to sprout through the fabric of the universe to forever change the laws of existence. The collector saw how thousands of bronze gears in the basements began to spin at a speed that generated flames, turning the very stone into something existing between matter and pure will. The mirrors, which served as gateways, began to crack, releasing clots of darkness that immediately took the form of human figures. The palace was no longer just a building. It had become a spatial node capable of transporting its essence to any point on the globe. With every second, it grew heavier, pulling the very matter of space toward itself, compressing it to a point of singularity. The air around the cliff boiled from electrical discharges, turning night into day under the influence of the monstrous radiation emanating from the very heart of this anomaly. The last thing the man who had once been an antique collector realized was that his personal history was finished forever. He had become fuel, the final missing component for a mechanism preparing to rewrite the history of humanity. He felt his name being erased from all archives and the memories of the few who might have remembered him. The palace consumed the last grain of his soul, and in that same second, the building, as if shaking off the heavy shackles of eternity, began to lift from the ground, becoming elusive to the ordinary human gaze, preparing to make its one, decisive leap into the future. In the morning, at the site where the Black Palace had stood for centuries, there remained only a flat, table-like patch of scorched earth upon which not even grass would grow. In a neighboring town, located 50 miles away from that place, at the same hour, a new fashionable hotel opened, built in a record-short amount of time. Guests marveled at the unusual architecture and the mirrors, which seemed suspiciously deep and alive. The owner of the hotel, whose face was always hidden by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, observed with satisfaction how people entering the doors gradually forgot their names and turned into faceless figures, whose reflections in the mirrors began to live lives of their own, hidden from them. The city administration could never explain how the colossal building had been erected in just 24 hours, bypassing all building codes and public oversight. Newspapers were filled with headlines about a triumph of modern engineering, while local residents, as if bewitched, flocked to the hotel lobby to book rooms. A strange anticipation hung in the air, similar to the sweetish smell of ozone that precedes an inevitable thunderstorm, although the sky over the city remained cloudless and clear. No one noticed that after entering the building, their shadows became shorter, and their voices took on a barely perceptible metallic tone. Inside the hotel, an atmosphere of absolute comfort reigned, which seemed too artificial for an ordinary establishment. Luxurious carpets absorbed the sound of footsteps, and the soft light of the chandeliers cast no familiar glints. The main attraction became the mirrors placed in every corridor, in which a guest's reflection would appear with a tiny, almost invisible delay. Guests who spent more than 48 hours in their rooms began to behave unnaturally, their gestures became repetitive, and their gaze unfocused, as if they were watching something that lay beyond the reach of ordinary sight. The owner of the hotel, who never left his office on the top floor, carefully studied the daily reports. In his notes, written in a fine, calligraphic hand, he recorded the time when each guest finally lost their connection to reality. Within the first 72 hours, a person would lose memories of their past, and by the end of the week, they would become a faceless servant of the palace, whose likeness would begin to seep into the surface of the mirrors. It was the perfect trap, hidden under the mask of elite service, where every guest became a new brick in the foundation of an eternal structure. None of those who crossed the hotel's threshold attempted to leave, even if they realized the metamorphoses taking place. Invisible threads, woven from the will of the palace itself, held them inside, forcing them to believe that here they had found their true purpose. The town around the hotel began to change, people became less talkative, their movements acquired a strange, mechanical synchronicity. An epidemic of forgetfulness spread with incredible speed, enveloping neighborhoods and turning a living community into puppets carrying out the will of an invisible master. When the last victim was consumed, a deafening silence fell over the hotel. The owner walked out into the lobby, and his hat, momentarily shifted by a gust of wind, revealed a face that was merely a pale sketch of human features, without eyes or lips. He took a step forward, and his body began to transform, once again taking the form of the Black Palace towering over the city, which by then had turned into scenery for his next game. The story, which began in the year 1920, finally reached its completion, leaving humanity in ignorance of the fact that their world had long since ceased to belong to them.